Hello, I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. And as well as making pottery at Oxford Clay, I also make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's sharing everything I've learned with you along my eco-conscious pottery journey. And I'm so glad you're here. I can't wait to share it with you. Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine and it's so nice to have you here. So in today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be talking about how to read a glaze recipe. So I have to say this really confused me when I first thought, I really want to make my own glaze. How on earth do I make my own glaze? And I got, a glaze recipe from a book and I was just looking at it and I was just like, I don't understand this. And it was so frustrating because I was like, I know it's doable, but I just don't understand like the sort of principles behind it, basically. So that's what this episode is all about. If you're thinking about making a glaze, you just always wondered like how glaze recipes like worked. This episode is for you. We're going to go through it. It's very like easy once you kind of understand the principles. So yeah, let's go. Okay, so the basic principle of a glaze recipe is that all the parts in the recipe, apart from the water part and the colour part, they generally add up to 100. So I have seen glaze recipes that don't add up to 100. They actually add up to like more than 100 or less than 100. But generally speaking, it's done in parts and those parts will add up to 100. So, right, let's take an example of a glaze recipe. Okay, so this is a glaze recipe from Eco-Conscious Pottery Glazing, the book, which is available on the Oxford Clay website. Let's take a recipe from the book. Oh, okay, this is a good recipe. Okay, let's write recipe number 9. So recipe number 9 is basically Cornish stone, 40 parts, dolomite, 20 parts, whiting, 20 parts, and quartz, 20 parts. So all of those parts add up, just checking they added up to 100. All of those parts add up to 100. And so what you do as a potter is you have to think to yourself, well, how much glaze do I want to make? And then what you do is you times the weight of however much glaze you want to make by these parts. So let's do an example. So say, for example, you just wanted to make like a really little glaze test. 100 grams of glaze powders would make a small glaze test, basically. So what you could do is you could say, okay, well, I want 100 grams of dried weight of my powdered glaze materials. So remember that like water is not included in this parts recipe. And any colorants are not included in this parts recipe. We're making like a base powder glaze. So if you think about like making a cake or something, this is like all the dry ingredients. So it's like the flour, the sugar. I can't think of any more dry ingredients for a cake. But yeah, it's all those dry ingredients for a cake. Okay, so maybe 2 different types of sugar or something. So all the dry ingredients, that's what we're making first of all. Then we're going to add the water on top and then we're going to add any colorants in on top. So it's a really good idea to have like a notebook, a glaze making notebook, or be writing it down anywhere you want to. It's really good to keep a record because it's so easy to forget like how much is the total that you're making. That I've done that before and it can be really confusing. So I think like a sort of good piece of advice maybe is just like make, if you're making like 100 grams or something, and then you think, okay, well, I want to make, the full glaze, you could start with, a kilogram of the dry ingredients, and you could see how much glaze that makes. And then you can always add, another kilogram on top, if it's not enough glaze. So, like if you make things easy for yourself, you can just do it like, say, like 1 kilogram at a time. And then that each of these parts, you can divide it by, make it into grams, basically. So a kilogram is 1,000 1,000 grams. So, okay, so let's use the example of making our 100-gram glaze test. So Cornish stone, if we are making like 100 grams of glaze, a little bit of glaze, we would need 40 grams of Cornish stone. And then we would need 20 grams of dolomite. Then we would need 20 grams of whiting, and then we would need 20 grams of quartz. So that's all the ingredients, all the dry ingredients. So you would weigh those out. I just weigh mine out with like kitchen scales, basically, and a bowl. And a top tip actually that I found really good is if you're weighing out the ingredients, it's a really good idea to have them in like separate bowls, because what I've done before is I've accidentally say like added too much of of something. If I'm weighing them all together in the same bowl and I'm just adding one on top of the other, if I accidentally add say like too much quartz or too much dolomite, because they're all white powders essentially, it's really hard to get out, get the quartz out again, and you don't really know what powder you're scooping out because all of the powders are white. So a really good top tip is to you can weigh out all your ingredients separately, and then you can add them into the bowl, or just have like a measuring bowl that you're weighing like each ingredient out at a time in, and then you can add it to your kind of main mixing bowl of all your dry ingredients. Just a quick safety message, you should be always wearing an FPP3 face mask when you're weighing out dry ingredients such as like rocks and clays, because those powders can really hurt your lungs, they damage your lungs. So you need to be wearing an FFP3 face mask, which covers your nose and mouth and creates a seal and just protects your lungs from the fine powders. Okay, safety note is over. Okay, so that's basically how you read a glaze recipe. So let's do another one, for example. Okay, we're going to do recipe 6 from the book Eco-Conscious Pottery Glazing, and this recipe is 50 feldspar, 30 wood or plant ash, 10 quartz and 10 china clay. Okay, so say we were making a kilogram of this glaze, we would need 500 grams of feldspar, we would need 300 grams of wood and plant ash, we would need 100 grams of quartz, and we would need 100 grams of china clay. So all of those ingredients add up to 100, and then we would have our 1 kilogram of clay. 1 kilogram of glaze. Clay and glaze are actually the same thing. That's probably why my brain got mixed up then. If you heat a clay to very high temperatures, it actually turns into a glaze. So a lot of these ingredients are the same ingredients. A lot of glaze ingredients are the same ingredients that you actually do use when you're making clay. Which is crazy. It's just that because they're sort of thinner on the pot, or maybe a flux has been added, in a sense like a plant ash has been added, then it kind of melts on top of the pot, and because the pot is thicker, the pot isn't melting at that point. Okay, so let's talk about then the kind of water aspect. So you've got your dry ingredients in the bowl, and if you're going to add a colourant, so quite often the colourants will say like 1 or 2 or probably up to like 5. That's probably quite a strong coloured glaze. So it will be, and what that means is like 1% or 2% or 5%. So say you've made, you've got your 100 grams test glaze. You would need 1 gram if it says 1 in the recipe. So all the recipes in the Eco-Conscious Pottery Glazing book, none of them actually have colourants at all. They're all coloured with like natural things like the plant ash or ball clay, which is like adds a bit of natural colour. But generally in other glaze books, your recipe books, you might find, say like 2% copper, or it might just be noted as 2 copper. So in that sense, if you're making 100 grams of your test glaze, you would need 2 grams of copper oxide or 2 grams of copper carbonate. Copper carbonate is a slightly less strong colourant than copper oxide. So, it might specify like which oxide or carbonate, whatever, to put in the recipe. Quite often glaze recipes will say, copper carbonate or, cobalt carbonate, instead of like cobalt oxide or something like that. So, Yes, okay, so that's how you would then add the dry ingredients of metal oxides to colour your glaze. So again, you would be weighing these out. You would be wearing your face mask. You might be wearing gloves. You really don't want to be touching metal oxides. You don't want to be ingesting them because a lot of them are very poisonous. So, you just be like super careful with that. So then you would add that into the dry ingredients. And then the water, as I mentioned previously, the water is never stated in a glaze recipe. And I found this so confusing when I was trying to make a glaze. I was like, well, like, okay, you've given parts, for all the other things. I know how to, measure these out. And I'm just making a kilogram of glaze. So I understand that I have, 500 grams of this and 300 grams of that. But how much water do I add? And the answer is it depends, on loads of different stuff. So that's why generally the water aspect isn't stated in a glaze, because so the reason it's not is that potters will maybe want a thicker glaze or a thinner glaze, and so each potter, it's kind of up to them to how much water they want to add, it can be super confusing. So the really important thing to say on the water thing is that don't worry if you add too much water. This is absolutely not a problem, because if you add too much water, you can just wait for the glaze to settle. So glaze ingredients generally always settle, say overnight or something. You'll have clear water on the top of your bucket, your glaze bucket, and you could just scoop it off. And then you mix up the glaze again and you think, what consistency do I want? Is this too thick? Is this not thick enough? You can always add a bit more water in. You can always wait for the glaze to settle again and then take a bit more water off. So it's really not a problem. So the water aspect is it seems quite stressful when you're just well, I don't know how much to add. But at the same time, it's really not a disaster. You can't ruin your glaze by adding too much water or too little water. And actually sometimes, annoyingly, you don't actually know what a glaze is going to look like until you fire it, if you know what I mean. So you might fire a glaze and then you might think, I think that needs to be a bit thicker. It's just not looking right. Or, it's too thick and it's all dribbling down the side onto the kiln shelf. Oh, it's too thick. Maybe it needs to be a bit thinner. So these are things that this is why it's not stated as well, because it's it up to each potter really to kind of say what they want and experiment with their own kind of kiln and their own thickness of pot and the way they want the glaze to look and all those different aspects. So that's why water is not stated. So generally speaking though, you want to be kind of aiming for the consistency of maybe single cream. So it's it's not thin and watery, but it's not really thick. So it's kind of single cream. You stir it all up, when it's all stirred up, it's kind of you would dip, your pot in and it would coat your pot, but it's not going to be so thick that it's just gets a really thick layer on. It's not going to be so thin that you hardly get any glaze on there. So single cream is a really good consistency to aim for. With the caveat of plant ash glazes, I've often found they quite like to be a tiny bit thicker. They actually work better if they're a little bit thicker. So when I've done my plant ash glazes, I've done it a little bit. I've done maybe double cream, maybe in between single cream, double cream kind of consistency, and they've worked a lot better than say other glazes which are maybe just made from crushed rocks. That kind of single cream is probably a better consistency for them. Okay, so let's have a quick recap. All glaze recipes generally will add up to 100 parts, and then what you do is you just times them up or down, or up, whatever, by the weight. Okay, so you're doing, just change the parts into grams and then times it up. Say you're making a kilogram, you would times those grams up by, maybe if it's 50 parts, you'd maybe have 500 grams, if you're making a kilogram. So that's what you're doing. You're translating the parts into grams, into weight, grams. And you're weighing all the ingredients out. Okay, then you're doing an oxide. You're weighing out the oxide, and that'll be 1%, 2%, maybe 1.5 if that's perhaps, or like up to like 5. I've seen some at like 7. That's generally for like an iron oxide or something. So, then there's that. So again, you're doing that as parts. So you're doing that, if you think about it as like a percentage, maybe that you're doing that as a part. So you just like times it again by the weight. And then you're adding the water on top. Once you've got all the ingredients, you're adding the water on top, and you want sort of single cream. So I know this isn't about like how to actually make a glaze, this episode, but just to say, once you've made your glaze and you've added the water, you would need to sieve it, especially if you've added oxides, because some oxides don't really disperse properly into the glaze unless it's sieved through a kind of very fine mesh glaze sieve. So that would be the process really. You're like adding the water, you're mixing it all up, then you're going to sieve it to kind of really distribute that oxide throughout the glaze. And then that's pretty much it. It's just like testing it, which is like the fun bit. So and like I said, don't worry if you add too much water, you can always scrape it off after the glaze is settled. And you might even need to add more water. If you've got your glaze stored for a long time, water does evaporate sort of out of your kind of lidded bucket of glaze. So you might even need to add water at a later date. So always be sort of like aiming for roughly that single cream consistency sort of thing. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this episode to talk about how to read a glaze recipe. Thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to see you on the next episode. And until then, happy potting, happy potential glaze making if that's something you're doing. And see you next time. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for joining me on the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. It's been fantastic having you here. And if you're interested to learn more about eco-conscious pottery, there are loads of resources for you on the Oxford Clay website. And the address is oxfordclay.co.uk, and I can't wait to see you there.